Is the good indefinable? Let's consider. Hello, philosophers. I'm Chico. Welcome to the Philosopher Show, where we consider the greatest questions of human history. One of the most famous philosophy questions is the what is question. What is beauty? What is justice? And recently we've been asking the question, what is good? And I think that we may have come to be a little bit frustrated here because we've looked at a number of different possibilities and none of them have been sufficient. So what is good? Maybe there's a reason we can't find an answer to that. Maybe there just is no definition of good. Maybe good is indefinable. Intuitionists believe that good is indefinable. They believe that it's a word much like existence. So if I were to tell you, for example, that ghosts aren't real, and you say, well, what do you mean by real? And I say, well, I mean that they don't exist. And you say, well, what do you mean by exist? And I would say, I don't know. Like, how do you define existence? Do you just point to a bunch of stuff and say, see what this stuff is all doing? Yeah, that's existing, right? So that's what the ghost is not doing. The ghost is not doing what these things are doing. And it might seem a little bit perturbing not to have a definition for goodness or to refuse to define goodness, but there has to be some terms like this. You know, we have a limited amount of words in our vocabulary. If we were to have nothing but words that were defined by other words, then we would have nothing but circular definitions, right? The words eventually would have to be defined by the other words, and those words would be defined by the first words, and it would just be a big circle. You have to, in order to avoid circular definitions, you have to be able to say, yeah, I'm talking about that thing over there, right? So maybe goodness is like that. Maybe it's something that we can't define using other words. We just point to it and say that thing right there. And in fact, philosopher G.E. Moore gives an argument for this. He says, number one, in a definition, the definiendum and the definiens are interchangeable. The definiendum is the thing being defined, and the definiens is what are you using to define it. Two, the definiendum, good, is not interchangeable with any definiens. And why is that the case? It's because it's always conceivable that the two are not the same thing. So take, for example, cultural relativism, which defined good as what is socially acceptable. Is it conceivable that society would accept something that's not good? I mean, it's conceivable, right? You can conceive that society would accept anything, and something's got to be bad. So necessarily, it's possible that the two would be different things, so they can't be identical. So the good, therefore, is indefinable in G.E. Moore's argument. Now, the good is indefinable, but the good is objective. And hopefully it makes sense why that would be, because typically when we want to say something is subjective, not objective, we reduce that thing, right? So we say good is nothing but being socially acceptable, or good is nothing but your personal feelings about the matter. And in this case, if good is not definable, then we can't say it's nothing but a this or nothing but a that. So it can't be reduced to something. So it can't be subjective in those ways. It's got to be objective. The question then is good real? And they believe that it is, but they believe that it's not provable that it's real. And that's okay. They say that nothing is provable that it's real, right? So I'm looking dead at a camera right now. Is that a real camera? Well, I might be dreaming right now. It might not be a real camera. It might just be a dream that I'm having. And the same way that you can't prove that good is real necessarily, you know, there's no argument that's going to show you that good is real. So if good is real and objective, it's not subjective, it's not reducible to anything, it must be its own thing. It must be its own sort of entity. So they believe that it's like a thin property. It's a property that things have that obviously you can't identify empirically. So it's a non-natural property. Now that's for the good itself. What about moral truths that are based on the good? They believe that basic moral truths are self-evident. Self-evident meaning that an adequate understanding of the proposition would justify you in believing it. Just understanding would be like, oh, okay, well, then it must be true. So there are non-moral examples of this, such as x equals x, right? X is identical to X. Anything is identical to itself. That is a proposition that is self-evident. A possible example of a self-evident moral truth, although here's where things get interesting. They don't all agree on what the self-evident truths are. So, like a possible one could be something like, never do gratuitous harm, right? Don't do harm when there's no reason for doing it. That is something that likely everybody could agree on, and seems, like once you understand it, you're like, oh yeah, that's got to be right. Although just because it's self-evident doesn't mean that it's obvious. There are plenty of self-evident things like that you can find in math that are just super hard to get. They're just not obvious things. Or some things that are obvious that are not self-evident because they're false. So for example, if I had, if P then Q, P therefore Q, so this is logic, not math, that seems obvious. If you have P, then you have Q, you have P, therefore you have Q, conclusion. That's self-evident, and that's legit, right? If I said, if you have P, then you have Q, therefore you have P, that might seem obvious to you. In fact, a lot of people think that that's legit, but that's actually invalid. That is not a valid way of arguing. So that is something that seems self-evident, but is not. And if we were to explore it further, we would see why that is. And so these are non-moral things. So there are self-evident things that we need to explore in order to, because we might make mistakes about them, or because they're not self-evident possibly at first sight. So if P then Q, not Q, therefore not P. Now that is true, and that also seems self-evident, but not at first. So why is it self-evident? If you have P, then you have Q. Let's say you don't have Q, right? What would happen if you had P? Well, if P then Q, you would have to have Q, right? But we just said you don't have Q. So you can't have P. So if you have P, then you have Q, you don't have Q, must mean that you can't have P. So that's something that is self-evident, but not self-evident right off the bat. How do we know that a proposition is self-evident? We get an intuition. And that's where the intuitionist portion of this comes in. An intuition, the ancient guys, or they're not that ancient actually, they are just older guys. The originals, the OGs, they believed that you had a direct apprehension of the self-evident truth. Like you just grasped it, you saw it directly. Whereas some modern intuitionists believe that really they're more of intellectual seemings. They're the way things seem to you. So the first way, like, you couldn't be wrong about them. If you directly perceive, you directly apprehend these truths, then you can't be wrong once you directly apprehend it. You could be mistaken at first. At first you can say, here's a self-evident truth. But then, you look at it closer and you're like, I was wrong. But once you've really dug in and you've researched it all and you see it, directly face to face, then you say, like, the if P then Q, P therefore Q. You're like, well, there's zero chance I'm wrong on this, right? This is self-evident truth. Whereas the intellectual seemings people, they would say, yeah, it seems right to you, right? And that's a reason to believe it, right? That's a good reason to believe it. In the same way as when you look out at the world, it seems like there's a camera in front of my face. That's a good reason to believe there is a camera in front of my face, even though I could be asleep right now. So that's Intuitionism. Let's look at a few objections. The first one is that natures are discovered empirically, whereas this would say that we get to the nature of goodness by some kind of intuition. So how do we discover the nature of water? Well, initially, it just seems like it's some clear liquid thing. It's not until we empirically, investigate that we discover that water is H2O. So we get to the nature of water through empirical investigation. Now, what about the nature of goodness? According to Intuitionists, we get to that not by empirical investigation, but by some kind of direct intellectual apprehension. Well, that seems like that's not the way that we get to the nature of things. So they say that this can't be right. This isn't getting the morality in the right way. It could be responded to this, however, that the water example is way different than goodness, right? Water, when we first start off and we look at it, we're defining it purely phenomenologically, right? We're just the way that it appears to us. And that's the only thing that we really are basing our definition on. It seems like we would need to investigate it empirically further. But is goodness like that? It doesn't seem like goodness, we're just looking at the surface level of goodness and we should look deeper into the goodness, right? That's not how we apprehend goodness. So it seems like goodness is a different kind of a concept, so that maybe that it doesn't make sense to talk about empirical investigation. In fact, I'm not sure how empirical investigation would really work here. A second objection is the source of our intuitions. So it seems like some of our intuitions are culturally derived. In fact, possibly all of them. So we can be raised in societies that have some wild ideas. Like, go ahead and check out my video on the burning widow, and you'll see what I'm talking about, right? You could be brought up in that society, and that could be normal to you. And when you consult your intuitions about what is the right thing to do, you might have a totally different idea than we might think is plausible. So maybe the source of our intuitions are something that make them not reliable. Of course, a possible response you can give here is that on some kind of basic level, that our intuitions all sort of match up. So take an extreme example of like two different societies, like modern United States and a cannibalistic society, let's say. So we might say, look, there are totally different moral intuitions here, and they're totally culturally driven. But possibly you could say that the underlying moral intuition and cannibalism is the survival of the tribe and the empowerment of the tribe, right? Like if they thought that, let's say, I don't know, this is probably showing my ignorance, but let's say they thought that if you eat the heart of your victim, then you gain their power. And let's say, that they think that that's right, then we could say, yeah, in our society, we think empowering the individual and I don't know, this is a real big stretch, but you can see sort of where I'm going with that. You could argue that way. Probably the biggest objection, though, is the moral disagreements. So the fact that if we all had these moral intuitions, we shouldn't disagree with each other so much. So one popular thing that has happened in my philosophy classes that my students will tell you about is I a lot of times like to introduce moral dilemmas just for funsies. I don't know, just to generate. Actually, typically I use it to introduce some kind of concept. But in introducing these moral dilemmas, you see that people will answer things in very different ways. So the most famous one is the trolley problem. And the trolley problem is, let's say you have 5 people that are tied down to one track and one person that's tied down to another track, and you have a runaway trolley that's heading to the 5 people. But you could throw a switch that would push the trolley over to the other person, to the one guy. You would save 5 lives, but you would kill 1 life. Would you do it? And when you present that, people will get in big debates. And then from there, you can say, well, let's change it up a little bit. Let's say that instead somebody is sitting on a trap door on a bridge over the trolley. And again, you have the 5 people that are tied down to the bridge, but no switch anymore. So they're not tied. They're tied on the tracks, excuse me. And so if you throw the switch, the trap door opens, a person falls down, dies, derails the trolley. and saves the 5 people, but you killed a person. And then you could change it and say, instead of a trap door, what if it was just a really big person and you push them off the side of the bridge, and that is what derailed the trolley? Would you push the person off? In all 3 scenarios, like you're killing a person to save 5 people, but it seems like the first one is like for some reason not as bad as like the third one. I don't know. They get really bizarre. And what's interesting is studies have been done on this problem, and it depends. The people's answers statistically depend on what order you present these arguments or these dilemmas in, and they depend on the delivery. They depend on like words that you use. All those kinds of things go into the way that we answer what we would do in these situations. So it seems like our intuitions are highly suspect because we get into this moral disagreement with each other and with even ourselves. Now, again, you could reply, but don't we agree in the basics? So we would all agree, don't harm somebody unless you have to, unless the good outweighs the bad. And we're just not sure what is the weight, so we all agree on that first principle, that we intuit that, but it's just that, like, how do we apply it in this situation? This situation is so hard to understand. So it's so, out of the ordinary that we just can't answer it. The problem for this response is it's not just a disagreement in these obscure cases, it's a disagreement in the basics. So, for example, some people will think that maximizing good consequences, that is the basic moral intuition. Some people think that the basic moral intuition is actually a list of moral intuitions, stuff like, don't kill innocent people, stuff like don't abort fetuses, right? Like intricate details of stuff. They'll think that there's a list of those things that you can intuit. So we don't agree on what we're intuiting, even on the very basic level. Not only that, but this is disagreement from people who have studied this for years, from experts in the subject. You would think if we have these basic moral intuitions that the experts would have all gotten some kind of consensus, but obviously they haven't. I don't think that kills this theory, though. I think that it makes it a lot more difficult, but I think that there's still a possibility. I think this just shows that if we have this kind of moral intuition, it's not the same kind of intuition that we have with stuff like mathematics. Those kinds of intuitions are clear, precise, and moral intuitions would be things that are not like that. In any case, that's it for Intuitionism. Please let me know if you have any questions. Also, please like, share, comment, subscribe, and tell all your friends, and go in the merch store and buy some stuff, and I will see you in the next video. Adios.